Hello, my name is Kapil, and this is my research talk for understanding the praxis and challenges of networked orchestration for winter quarter of 2020. And so there's a critical need to support ill-structured problem solving. These problems are often have very many different solutions that make it difficult for any one person to be able to solve them without additional support. And one way to support this practice is to support continual learning, help seeking, and collaboration. However, there's practical orchestration challenges for learning communities in orchestrating each of these three aspects. For example, novices can struggle to learn and develop the skills needed for planning, and they also may not know how to seek help or what resource to use. In addition, when resources are needed for help seeking, the resource may actually be limited on time or unavailable altogether, which can hinder collaboration. And so while experts in the community can help with some of the planning and help seeking interactions, as these communities grow, it becomes increasingly difficult to handle all of novices' needs. In particular, traditional models of orchestrating research involve either one-to-one apprenticeship models or a one-to-one-to-one model where, for example, a PhD student might be mentored by a postdoc who is mentored by a faculty member. But these models still create bottlenecks in who can help whom. Instead, we consider this idea of dispersed or networked orchestration, where the model of organizing is dispersed across an entire community. So one example of networked orchestration in practice is the Agile Research Studio, or ARS, socio-technical model for scaling research communities of practice. It enables small numbers of experts, in this case, 2 faculty members and their PhD students, to sustainably train 20 or 30 undergrads through a use of various agile processes for work, different social structures for project teams and groups of project teams under PhD students, and virtual tools to support the orchestration process, such as tools for planning or research tracking. And so what we aim to do in this study is to understand better how ARS actually works by studying one community. And so there's been a lot of previous work in studying community practice for complex work. And these include collaboratories, which were organizational structures to promote remote research, and particularly for sharing data and computational resources. There's also been more recent work on crowdfunding platforms where creators rely on social technologies and experts during the funding process, and makerspaces where creators rely on experts at different stages of product development. And so while these communities generally provide resources, they don't often actually provide explicit structures to address needs of novices on working on ill-structured problems. Moreover, these prior works are actually more based on like the emergent behavior environment rather than explicit coaching on how to actually help seek or how to use a specific network like we find in our ARS setting. And so on the tool side, there's actually been done quite a lot of work on how to actually orchestrate some of these processes. And so one includes tools in the classroom setting where you might, for example, visualize students' progress to teachers so that teachers can determine who to provide help to in a classroom setting. But of course, in this case, in our case, we're actually studying open-ended research work, which is a little bit harder to orchestrate because you don't have concrete checkpoints such as what problem you're on or what kind of work you're doing, and students might be at different places in their research. Instead, maybe a closer area of work is problem-based learning environments, which have explored tools for tracking project needs and also planning future work and providing distributed opportunities for different problem needs. And so what our work does is explore how that scales beyond just having one or two resources and having structures for actually supporting a variety of help-seeking tasks in the community. And lastly, for CSAW, there's a lot of tools that help to find appropriate expertise for specific problems within an organization, but they have limited emphasis on teaching how to help seek and how to use different resources. And so in contrast, in our setting, having explicit structures for how to do these things is something that we want to understand in our setting, so that we can then design tools that better use those processes as part of the research work or the help-seeking process. And so this leads us to the following 4 research questions for our study. First, how do students navigate the various processes and tools found in a distributed setting like ARS to orchestrate their research and learning goals? And then, in what ways do mentors support students during this orchestration process? And then moving forward, what breakdowns do students and mentors face during the orchestration process? And finally, based on these challenges, what are new tools that we can design in order to help people in this distributed community setting? And so our work makes 2 key contributions. The first is a qualitative study of networked orchestration in the context of research training done using the ARS, Agile Research Studio model. And the second is design implications for future networked orchestration technologies. And so in order to do the study, we studied one instance of an ARS at Northwestern University. We conducted 8 observations at special interest group planning meetings that were 1 hour long and collected field notes during those observations. We also conducted 25 hours of semi-structured interviews across 19 people in the community, including faculty mentors, PhD student mentors, and undergraduates, where we were focused on asking students how they use various resources and outlets in DTRs and what struggles they had. We also asked mentors in what ways they support students during this help-seeking process, and we also did follow-up interviews with revised protocols as we found themes emerge that dug deeper into both of these concepts. These interviews were all recorded and then transcribed afterwards. And we took a thematic analysis approach where we first open and coded all of our interview data, and as themes emerged, we went and recoded the data based on those themes. And so we have 3 main key findings. The first is that students are able to create varied help-seeking strategies based on their needs. 2, mentors are able to coach students on how to more effectively use resources in the community. And then for challenges, we found that students have a challenge of maintaining expertise awareness of the entire community, and mentors have challenges in limited awareness of what individual students are doing and tracking the needs of all of their students at once. And let's talk about a little of these in a little more detail. So starting with students, students first highlighted that they chose resources based on the kinds of needs that they had, and determined whether or not they would ask a mentor for help or another student for help based on what they were doing. So for example, David highlights how more straightforward tasks that he's done before are things that he doesn't need mentors' help for. And so those are things that he would either try to do on his own, or if he needed help, he would ask other peers in the community. Instead, for more conceptual aspects of the work, Jason reported going to their SIGHAT or faculty mentor instead of another student, because mentors often have more context about a student's project and an idea of the research direction, which is important if they have more conceptual questions about their project that need guidance that other students may not actually be able to give. And so once students determined what resources might be useful for help-seeking need, they then chose resources based on the availability. And so George here talks about how he would, if it's close to our studio time, then he'd get pair research help on a topic from his peers. If it wasn't close to that, but close to office hours, for example, he would go see his faculty mentor, Henry, for help. And in other cases, he would just go and ask Robert, his SIGED, for more opportunistic check-ins if he needed help. And so in this way, we find that the network of resources available in ARS allows students to be very flexible about where and when they seek help on their needs. To know how to pick resources for specific needs, students reported various approaches about building models of expertise in the community. One that Alex talks about here was to simply just work with different people in the community, and that helped him build some knowledge of what each person could do. And in this community that we studied, we found that these processes are actually facilitated by things like pair research, which is a structured help-seeking session that all students participate in during studio meetings. And because they're matched with other students who they typically don't work with, this allows them to learn about the expertise that other people have. And students also reported gaining awareness by simply spending time with one another in the communal workspace, where students like Scott, for example, observe what things that others are working on based on conversations or what they write on the whiteboard. And so while the community is overall still a distributed community, having opportunities to interact face-to-face with one another or work in the same space allows students to build this kind of representation of what others are doing. And lastly, students also sought help from others when they were unsure who to ask for help or didn't know who could help them with something. So here, Vanessa, who's a first quarter student in the community, asked a more experienced peer who was also her mentor, her community mentor, who could help with qualitative coding. And that community mentor was able to point to another grad student who was experienced in qualitative analysis that she didn't know. And that way she was able to get help from a peer who she didn't know directly or had not interacted with directly before. To support students in this process, because they're novices learning how to conduct research, mentors coach them on how to use resources more effectively. And one way to do this is to help students think about how you actually want to use a resource before you do it. So here at a SIG meeting, Henry, with a faculty mentor, helped an undergrad think about how to use office hours to understand user populations. Instead of just coming to office hours and having them talk about their issues, he actually prompted them to think about what potential user populations might look like, and then they could talk more about it during office hours. And so what this helps students do is learn what kind of work needs to be done before seeking help from a mentor or peer, so that help seeking sessions are more effective for them. But interestingly, in some cases, we also found that our mentors don't directly help students and instead simply tell them to go to someone else in the community who can also help them with their need. And so, for one example, Laura was working with one of her undergraduate students who was a first quarter student and noticed that he was struggling filling out their sprint planning logs at SIG meetings. And so, what she ended up doing was recommending that he go and talk to um, his community mentor because that person could help him fill out his sprint log. And in this way, she was able to help preserve her limited time to help other students that she had with more critical research needs that she was better suited to handle. So while we've shown that network orchestration is effective at distributing help seeking across a community, there are still challenges that are now invoked by using this distributed work practice. And so, for example, even though we showed that students are able to maintain awareness of and expertise of what community people know, it's still hard to track expertise of what people that they don't interact with know. And so, for example, Scott talks about how even though he is able to track the expertise of a few people that he routinely sees, it's just hard for him when the community gets larger and larger. And so this suggests that the increased scale that network orchestration allows may actually pose other challenges about community awareness that aren't well supported right now. Students also worried about getting the help they need from peers that they're unfamiliar with. And so here, Vanessa talks about how even though she would like to get help from others, she rather wants to go to the people that she knows that can already help her because it might save her time and she knows that she can get reliable help. And so what happens here is that you have expertise get overburdened sometimes because people go to the same resources over and over again, rather than asking for help from others in the community who probably could help. On the mentor side, we found that a key challenge was mentors maintaining awareness of what their students are working on, struggling on. And so Nancy here talks about how work practices outside of one-to-one meetings with her students can be kind of opaque. So she specifically mentioned how one of her students she would tell to maybe go and talk to another student for help, but it's not necessarily she's not necessarily sure if that student actually went and got their help or followed up on other tasks until the next meeting, which is challenging because then she doesn't have any awareness into how students are working throughout the week. In addition, as you get many students in network orchestration, you have a challenge of tracking many projects and all their needs at once. And so here Henry talks about how it's difficult to know what types of risks that students have in each of their projects and how to both push them on that and then push their research forward, but then also push forward how they're working in better work practices. And so this lack of awareness or lack of support for knowing what all the students need makes it difficult for mentors to teach the skills that students will need in order to work most effectively in the research community. And so given these challenges, how might we design new networked orchestration technologies that support students and mentors. And so for students, we consider the need for tools that track community expertise and tools that also help community expertise grow. For mentors, we think about tools for promoting awareness outside meetings and enable them to provide mentorship when they're not directly there with a student without putting additional burden on them. And so, first, for students, what we need are tools that help surface the expertise that community members have to one another without necessarily interacting with them. And so, one thing we may consider is to use data from the tools that we currently have in these kinds of networked orchestration settings to surface different kinds of expertise that people have. Even further, we may consider that the design of tools that help to reason about future gaps in expertise, caused by, for example, students graduating the community when they become seniors. So, for example, if there are multiple students who are experienced in iOS development that will graduate soon, having tools that can help reason about these expertise or resources leaving the community will help us understand what new resources we need to build early on before that gap happens. And even still, though, the challenge for students could be identifying and fixing ineffective work practices in the first place. So while mentors know how to resolve issues and have effective mentoring strategies, they're very limited on time with students to work on all the different kinds of things that they have. And they don't have awareness of how students are working outside of meetings, which requires them to now spend more time in meetings on diagnosing issues. So one thing we might try instead is to actually promote ways of designing encodings that represent what mentors want to be able to do, and be able to detect those potential script conditions when when students are working outside of meetings. And so this would allow them to provide to students with feedback on the working process, but without having to spend more time because these systems would work on the existing data in the community. And so to close, the core takeaways that we present today are that networked orchestration is able to provide this network of resources that students can use to address their needs. And that students seek help based on the different kinds of needs, availability of resources, and the expertise of resources that they know. The needs, if they go to mentor, are often also rerouted to other resources that are more available. But even still, students and mentors still struggle to be effective in these kinds of distributed network orchestration settings. In these cases, we see that students may have trouble identifying resources that can help if they're unfamiliar with them, and mentors may struggle to know how to help students outside of meetings because they don't know how students are working. And the design implication of all of this is that we need better tools and technologies to support networked orchestration. That may include better tools for identifying expertise in the community, and also tools for helping encode and enact mentors' existing orchestration strategies outside of one-to-one meetings.